Titolo, how 150 British soldiers held off 400 Zulu warriors, using biscuit boxes as shields 22 January 1879. 3:30 p.m. Rorke's Drift Mission Station, Natal border. You are standing in the dirt. The African sun is a physical weight on your shoulders, heavy, oppressive, and burning at 35 degrees Celsius. You look down at your hands. They are gripping the walnut stock of a Martini-Henry Mark II rifle. Your palms are slick with sweat and gun oil. The barrel is already hot to the touch, and you haven't even fired a shot yet. Now, look at your defense. It is a pile of rubbish. You are crouching behind a wall made of biscuit boxes. Wooden crates, tins of hardtack, sacks of corn violently dragged from a warehouse and stacked 4 feet high. You can read the stencilled letters on the wood. COMMISSARIAT DEPT. Biscuits. It looks ridiculous. A grocery delivery meant to stop an army. Then the ground starts to vibrate. Thump, thump, thump. You look up at the Oscarberg Hill. The horizon shifts from dusty brown to a deep moving black, like oil spilling over a ridge. 400 men, the Zulu impis. The finest light infantry in the world. They have just sprinted 5 miles after butchering 300 of your friends at Isandlwana. They are high on adrenaline. They are washing their spears in blood. And they are screaming one word, Usutu. You look at the 400 warriors. Then you look at the 149 men standing next to you. The maths is terrifying. 27-1. If every man here kills 26 people, the 27th still kills you. There is no air support, no radio, no cavalry coming over the hill. Just you, a single-shot rifle, and a wooden box. To your left, Lieutenant John Chard checks his Webley revolver. He stands perfectly still. "Steady, lads," he says. His voice cuts through the chanting. Steady. You rest your rifle barrel on a sack of corn. The first Zulu warrior clears the scrub. He spots the wall. He raises his spear. And in that split second, one thought screams in your mind. How? How did the British Army end up cowering behind food crates? And how, in God's name, are we going to survive the next 12 hours? To understand the answer, we have to go back to when the air still smelled of tea, not fear. 12:00 p.m. 4 hours earlier. 12:30 p.m. The calm before the slaughter. The air at Rorke's Drift tasted of pipe tobacco and stewed tea. It was a supply depot, not a fortress. A Swedish mission station requisitioned by the army, sitting quietly on the Buffalo River. Major Spaulding had ridden out hours earlier, leaving Lieutenant John Chard with an order that would soon sound like a cruel joke. You will be in charge, although nothing is likely to happen. Chard was down by the river, washing his trousers. Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead, commanding B Company, was sitting in the camp. His men were writing letters home or sleeping under the wagons. The heat made everyone lethargic. Then, the sound of water splashing violently broke the silence. 2 riders galloped across the drift. They weren't riding, they were fleeing. Horses foaming, eyes wide. One was Lieutenant Adendorf. He slid off his horse and hit the dirt hard. He was covered in a gray dust that looked like ash. Chard ran up from the riverbank. Bromhead stood up. "Adendorf?" Bromhead asked. "Where is the column?" Adendorf didn't salute. He didn't stand to attention. He just looked at the ground and vomited. When he finally looked up, his face was a mask of sheer, hollow shock. "Gone," he rasped. "Who is gone?" "The army, the general, the 24th. Adendorf wiped his mouth. "Isandlwana is dead, every man." The words hung in the hot air. 300 men. The invincible column, butchered in an afternoon. "And," Adendorf added, his voice cracking, "the impis is coming here, 3, maybe 4,000. The choice. The camp froze. You could see the panic hit the men like a contagion. Soldiers grabbed their rifles. Eyes darted to the horses. The instinct to run is primal. Chard and Bromhead looked at the map. They had minutes to decide. "We load the wagons," Bromhead said, his voice tight. "We retreat to help Makar. With the wounded. It was James Dalton who spoke. He wasn't an officer. He was a commissary, a supply man, a veteran who counted rations. He stepped into the circle of officers. "If we run," Dalton said, pointing to the hospital building, "we have to leave the sick or we slow down." He looked at the scrubland stretching towards Helpmakar. "In the open, the Zulus will catch us in an hour. They run faster than oxen." "So we stay?" Bromhead asked. "In a garden?" Dalton didn't argue. He turned and kicked a massive sack of corn near the storehouse. "We don't stay in a garden, sir. We stay in a fort." "We have no walls, Dalton." Dalton pointed to the massive pile of supplies, the livelihood of the army. "We have 20 tons of mealie bags. We have boxes of biscuits. We have wagons." He looked Chard in the eye. "We build a wall, now." Chard looked at the terrified men. He looked at the dust rising on the horizon. The engineer in him took over. The panic vanished, replaced by cold calculation. "Strike the tents," Chard ordered. "Get everyone on the wall, including the sick." It was 1:00 p.m. They had 2 hours to turn a grocery stockpile into a fortress, or they would all be dead by sunset. 2:00 p.m., the breaking point. Have you ever tried to lift a sack of mealies? It weighs 200 pounds, 90 kilos. It is dead weight that slips through sweaty fingers and scrapes skin raw. Now, try moving hundreds of them in 35-degree heat, while the sound of an approaching army vibrates through the soles of your boots. The camp exploded into manic energy. This wasn't engineering. It was desperation. Lieutenant Chard stood in the center of the chaos. He stopped looking at the birds and started looking at the angles. "Connect the storehouse to the hospital," he shouted. "Biscuits to close the gap." The soldiers became laborers. Privates dragged the massive biscuit boxes from the storehouse. These were heavy wooden crates, lined with tin, filled with hardtack. They weighed 100 LEBs each. They slammed them down. Thud, thud, thud. A wall rose out of the dirt, 4 feet high. Ideally, you want a fortress wall to be 10 feet high. They settled for high enough to rest a rifle on. 2:30 p.m. The collapse. The perimeter was huge, roughly 300 yards. Chard had about 400 men, counting the native Natal contingent, NNC, local allies armed with old muskets. With 400 rifles, the wall was defendable. Then, the NNC soldiers heard it. The thunder of 4:00 feet, the chant of Usuthu. They knew what had happened at Isandlwana. They knew what Zulus did to prisoners. Terror is contagious. One man dropped his musket, then 10, then 300. They vaulted the new wall and sprinted for the hills. Inside the camp, a British corporal raised his rifle to shoot the deserters. "Let them go," Chard snapped. In 30 seconds, the defending force dropped from 450 to 150. Chard looked at the perimeter. The wall was now too long. The gaps were too wide. There was 1 soldier for every 2 yards of wall. If the Zulus punched through a single point, the massacre would be over in minutes. The box within a box. Chard didn't freeze. He improvised. "We need a second line," he muttered. He ordered a retrenchment. A wall of biscuit boxes built perpendicular across the middle of the camp, connecting the storehouse to the stone kraal. If the outer wall fell, and he knew it would, they could retreat behind this inner wall. A killing zone made of food crates. 3:30 p.m. The last biscuit box was slammed into place. Hands were bleeding, chests were heaving. The men grabbed their Martini-Henrys. Then the lookout on the roof shouted the words that stopped time. "Here they come." It wasn't a patrol. The vanguard of the Zulu army swept around the Oscarburg Hill like a dark tide. They didn't stop to organize. They didn't negotiate. They saw the red coats. They saw the pile of boxes, and they charged. The building was done. The butchery was about to begin. 4:20 p.m. The collision. The first sound wasn't gunfire. It was the hissing of spears against cowhide shields. Hiss, hiss, hiss. Like a rattlesnake on a massive scale, 600 warriors of the Indlu Yengwe regiment broke from the main body. They didn't jog. They sprinted. A dead run across the scrub, aiming straight for the south wall. Lieutenant Bromhead stood tall. "Present!" The rifle snapped up. "Fire!" Crack thump. The volley fire of 100 Martini-Henry rifles is a physical force. It punches you in the chest. A massive cloud of white sulfurous smoke instantly blinded the line. The 450 caliber soft lead slug is brutal. At 50 yards, it doesn't just kill, it destroys. Through the smoke, the front rank of the Zulus disintegrated, but the ones behind didn't stop. They stepped over their dead brothers, they climbed over the bodies, and then they hit the wall. This was the moment the reality of the fortress set in. It was 4 feet of groceries. A Zulu warrior could vault it. A British soldier could lean over and stab downwards. It became a bar fight. Private Hitch shot a warrior point blank, the muzzle touching the man's chest. When he couldn't reload fast enough, he used the bayonet. Get back, you bastards." The biscuit boxes became slick. Blood doesn't soak into tin-lined wood, it pools. Men were slipping on the gore, sliding into the gaps between the mealie bags. The killing jar. The Zulus realized they couldn't just smash through the wall, so they moved to the high ground. Hundreds of warriors climbed the rocky terraces of the Oscarberg Hill overlooking the station. They began to rain fire down into the camp. It was a shooting gallery. To shoot, you had to stand up. Corporal Scammell took a bullet through the shoulder and went down screaming. Storekeeper Byrne, a civilian logistics man, ran to give him water. A bullet took Byrne in the head. He fell dead across a crate of biscuits. The perimeter was holding, but barely. Jard wiped blood from his face and saw the real problem. The Zulus were swarming around the side. They were ignoring the storehouse. They were targeting the weakest link, the building with the thatched roof, the building full of invalids, the hospital. The wall was holding, but the house was burning. And inside that burning house, the horror was about to begin. 5:00 p.m., the Inferno. The battle for the perimeter was war. What happened in the hospital was a horror story. The hospital building was isolated at the far edge of the defensive line. It had no connecting walls, no trenches, just a series of small, disconnected rooms filled with 30 sick and wounded men. Some were delirious with fever. Others were strapped to their beds with broken legs. Defending them were a handful of privates, including Henry Hook. Hook was a cook. He was known as a bad character, a man with a disciplinary record for insubordination and malingering. He was the type of soldier officers usually wanted to discharge. But in the next hour, inside a burning building, the shirker would become the most lethal man in the British Army. The Zulus, realizing the biscuit box wall was holding, changed tactics. They set the hospital's thatched roof on fire. The dry grass caught instantly. Thick, acrid yellow smoke rolled down into the wards, blinding the defenders. Burning debris began to rain from the ceiling, setting blankets and uniforms alight. The jam, the wooden door splintered inward. A Zulu warrior lunged through the smoke. Spear raised. Hook leveled his Martini-Henry. He pulled the trigger. Click. The weapon had failed. The Martini-Henry had a fatal flaw. When the barrel overheated from rapid fire, the brass cartridge case expanded and fused to the chamber walls. Hook was standing in a burning room facing a warrior with a spear, holding a useless metal stick. He didn't freeze. He didn't panic. A primal rage took over. He flipped the rifle, gripping the searing hot barrel with his bare hands, and swung the heavy wooden butt like a club. The impact smashed the warrior backward. Hook finished him with the bayonet. The mousehole. "Get the patients out!" Hook screamed to Private John Williams, but there was no exit. The doors leading to the courtyard were blocked by swarms of Zulus. They were trapped. They improvised a desperate escape plan. They couldn't go out, so they had to go through. While Hook held the door against the attackers, stabbing, clubbing, screaming, Williams took a pickaxe to the interior mud brick wall. Imagine the scene. The roof is collapsing, the air is unbreathable. You are hacking at a solid wall while your mate holds back an army inches away. A hole appeared. Small, ragged, just big enough for a man. They dragged the patients through the dust and rubble into the next room. Then they did it again. Defend the door, hack the wall, drag the screaming men, retreat. The last stand of the Joneses. In another ward, Privates Robert Jones and William Jones, not related but brothers in blood that day, faced their own nightmare. They stood at a doorway shielding 7 patients. The Zulus surged against them for 45 minutes. The heat was so intense it blistered their skin. Their uniforms smoked. Robert Jones was stabbed 4 times with assegais. He was bleeding profusely, barely able to stand. But he refused to step back. They turned the doorway into a pile of dead bodies, using the corpses of the enemy as a shield to keep fighting. The escape. Finally, Hook and Williams reached the last room. The window looked out onto the courtyard, behind the safety of the biscuit box wall. But it was high off the ground. They had to lift the patients, men screaming in agony as their broken bones shifted, and drop them out of the window into the dirt below. Hook was the last man inside. The roof gave a final groan. The main beam snapped. Hook vaulted onto the windowsill. As he jumped, the building behind him collapsed in a roar of sparks and flame. He hit the ground hard, eyebrows singed off, tunic hanging in rags. He looked up. The hospital was gone. It was just a pillar of fire now. But around him, groaning in the dirt, were the patients. Most of them were alive. The British had lost the building. They had lost the garden. The perimeter had shrunk to a tiny circle around the storehouse. But the bad character had saved them. The sun was gone. The only light now came from the burning hospital, casting long, dancing shadows across the kill zone. The Zulus vanished into the dark, preparing for the night attack. 8:00 p.m., the box within a box. Night had fallen over Natal, but darkness had not. The burning hospital was now a roaring inferno, casting a surreal, flickering orange light over the kill zone. For the Zulus, this was a tactical disaster. The fire acted like a massive spotlight, illuminating the warriors as they massed on the Oscarburg Hill for their charges. But for you were in the shadows, crouched behind the inner wall of biscuit boxes. The retrenchment Chard had built as a failsafe. You were invisible until the muzzle flash gave you away. The perimeter had shrunk. The garden was lost. The hospital was a ruin. All that remained of the British position was the storehouse and a tiny yard protected by a wall of crates. The war had become intimate. The attackers were no longer 400 yards away. They were 5 yards away. You could see the sweat glistening on their skin. You could hear the intake of breath before they screamed, "Usuthu," the mechanical killing. It stopped being a battle. It became a job. A gruesome, repetitive factory line of death, load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. The physical toll of the Martini-Henry was horrific. After 4 hours of continuous firing, your shoulder wasn't just sore. It was bruised black and blue from the heavy recoil. Your face was blackened with oily powder residue. Your eyes were stinging. Worst of all, your nose was bleeding. The constant concussive force of the volley fire was liquefying the capillaries in your sinuses. And the thirst. The water cart had been left outside the final wall during the retreat. It might as well have been on the moon. Men were licking the sweat off their own lips. Their tongues were swollen in their mouths. But they kept firing. The ammunition crisis. "Ammo! We need ammo!" The cry went up and down the line. 150 men firing for hours consumed lead at a terrifying rate. The reserve pouches were empty. The quartermaster system had collapsed. There was no time for keys or crowbars. Officers sprinted to the reserve wagons in the center of the yard. They smashed the heavy wooden crates open with rocks and rifle butts. They didn't count rounds. They filled their helmets with loose cartridges and ran back to the wall, dumping handfuls of brass casings at the feet of the men. "Here, take it. Keep firing." Lieutenant Chard was no longer the quiet engineer sketching birds. He was kneeling at the wall, his Webley revolver in hand, firing point blank into the smoke. Lieutenant Bromhead, the deaf aristocrat, was fighting with a rifle he had taken from a dead private, shouting orders he could barely hear himself over the roar. 10:00 p.m. The shift. The fire in the hospital finally began to die down. The roof collapsed inward, and the spotlight faded. Real darkness finally swallowed the drift. This was worse. Much worse. The mass human wave charges stopped. The Zulus changed tactics. They became ghosts. They crawled through the tall grass. They crept up to the biscuit boxes in the pitch black. A sudden rush of 10 men here. A lunge of 20 men there. They were probing, trying to find a gap, trying to find a soldier who had fallen asleep. But nobody slept. The adrenaline was toxic now, burning in the veins. You stared into the blackness until your eyes watered, trying to distinguish a rock from a warrior. Every rustle of dry grass sounded like death. You looked at the man next to you. He was slumped against a mealy bag, shaking uncontrollably. "They're not stopping," he whispered. "They're never going to stop." You looked at the biscuit box in front of you. It was splintered, bullet-scarred, and stained dark with blood. It was the only thing holding back the end of the world. The clock ticked past midnight. The bodies were piling up on both sides of the wall, and the longest night of your life was only halfway done. 4:20 a.m., 23 January. The shooting stopped. It didn't fade away. It just stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. It pressed down on your ears, ringing with a phantom echo. You lowered your rifle. Your arms were shaking so violently you could barely hold the weight of the wood and steel. You looked around the perimeter. It looked like a slaughterhouse. The ground was carpeted with brass cartridges. There were bodies everywhere. 17 of your mates were dead, lying in the mud behind the wall. Almost everyone else was wounded, bleeding from scalps, shoulders, legs. Hook was burned. Dalton was shot. Hitch was shot. You looked at Lieutenant Chard. He looked like a ghoul. His red tunic was torn to rags. His face was a mask of soot and dried blood. He was smoking a pipe. His hand was trembling, but he smoked. "Check your pouches," he croaks. You checked. You counted the brass rounds. 1, 2, maybe a loose one in your pocket. That was it. 2 rounds per man. The entire British defense, the projection of imperial power, was down to 2 bullets per soldier. The cold. The sun came up slowly, and with the dawn came the cold. The African night freezes you after the sweat of battle. You started to shiver, teeth chattering uncontrollably. You huddled against the biscuit boxes for warmth. The same boxes that saved your life were now your pillow. 7:00 a.m. The sun hit the Oscarberg Hill, and suddenly the shadows on the ridge stood up. "Stand to," Bromhead shouted. His voice was a rasp, but it was enough. You dragged yourself up. Your legs felt like lead. You looked at the hill. They were back. Thousands of them. The Zulus lined the ridge. They rested the bottom of their long shields on their toes. They were silent. You looked at the man next to you. He didn't cry, he didn't pray. He just reached into his pouch, took his last cartridge, and loaded it into the breech. Click-clack. Then he reached for his bayonet. He slid the 21-inch steel spike onto the end of his rifle. Click. This was it. The final stand. No ammo, no water, no hope. Just a wall of boxes and a piece of sharp steel against an army. You waited for the chant. You waited for the Usuthu. You waited to die. But the chant never came. The Zulu commander on the hill raised his spear. He looked down at the tiny fort. He looked at the burnt hospital. He looked at the pile of dead warriors, over 350 of them, encircling your wall. And then he saluted. A gesture of respect. He turned his back, and the entire army began to walk away. Not running, walking, disappearing back into the hills from where they came. You watched them go. You kept your rifle raised. You didn't trust it. It took 10 minutes for them to vanish, and then, for the first time in 12 hours, you let out the breath you were holding. Your knees gave way. You slid down the biscuit boxes and hit the dirt. They didn't leave because they were scared. They left because they were exhausted. They hadn't eaten in 3 days. They had seen the British relief column miles away in the distance. And as one Zulu later said, "We had no more heart to fight men who turned boxes into stones." The battle was over. The silence was back. But when the general arrives, he won't believe what he sees. The aftermath. When Lord Chelmsford's relief column finally rode into the camp later that morning, the soldiers didn't cheer. They were too tired to speak. The general stopped his horse and looked around in silence. He expected to find a graveyard. He expected to find another Isandlwana, burned wagons and disemboweled corpses. Instead, he saw a British flag still flying. He saw smoke rising from the ruins of the hospital. And he saw a wall. A ridiculous, battered, bullet-riddled wall of biscuit boxes. Lieutenant Chard walked out to meet him. He didn't look like an officer anymore. He looked like a survivor of the apocalypse. He couldn't salute properly. His arm was too stiff from the recoil of his revolver. He just pointed to the perimeter. The cost. The butcher's bill was read out in the morning light. British casualties. 17 killed in action. 15 wounded. Zulu casualties. 351 confirmed dead bodies found around the wall. Estimates suggest another 500 wounded were carried away by the retreating impis. The medals. News of the defense hit London like a thunderclap. After the total humiliation of Isandlwana, the Empire desperately needed a miracle. Rorke's drift was it. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for that single night. It remains the highest number of VCs ever awarded to a regiment for a single engagement in British military history. To Chard and Bromhead, the officers who didn't run. To Hook and the Joneses, the privates who held the burning doors. To James Dalton, the supply officer who suggested building the wall. The meaning. Why does this story survive? Why do we still talk about Rorke's drift 140 years later? It's not because of imperial glory. It's not about politics or colonization. It is about the architecture of will. The lesson of the biscuit boxes is universal. The defenders of Rorke's drift were ordinary men. They were scared. They were outnumbered 27-1. They didn't have a fortress. They didn't have reinforcements. They didn't have hope. They just had supplies. Mundane, boring, everyday objects. Tins of crackers. Sacks of corn. Lieutenant Chard wasn't a tactical genius. He was just a man who knew that when you cannot run, you must build. Private Hook wasn't a superhero. He was just a man who decided that this doorway was his, and nobody was getting through it.